We're going to replace you with someone else. You're two. Charles Whitmore stopped mid-sentence and lifted his glass, as if punctuation were optional. Laughter thinned into an obedient silence. I stood there. Bella Ross, Director of Strategic Operations, the person who had stitched together acquisitions, stabilized vendors, and kept regulators calm when storms hit. Tonight, at a company celebration, my father-in-law decided I had an expiration date. He didn't need to finish the word. He never does. In this room, he is the CEO of Whitmore Solutions, and half sentences land like verdicts. Faces turn toward me, then away, already rehearsing the version they would repeat. I watched him pivot and gesture toward Evan Whitmore, freshly pressed, smiling like a promise nobody had read. "The future," Charles said. Clinking crystal. The room applauded the idea, not the person. This story is a fictionalized account created to explore power, fairness, and dignity in the workplace. Some details are dramatized, and AI is used to help shape the narrative and emotional flow. If stories like this aren't helpful for you right now, please feel free to pause, rest, and prioritize your well-being. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my record or list the contracts that still bore my fingerprints. Silence was safer than spectacle, and I could feel the pressure of it tightening behind my ribs. Charles enjoys control that doesn't leave marks. Evan enjoys attention that hasn't been earned. Between them, I existed as a convenient bridge they could burn without ash. Someone asked me to say a few words. I declined, thanked the caterer, and set my glass down with care. The choice was deliberate. If I spoke, I would legitimize the premise that I was being evaluated. I wasn't. I was being erased. As the music restarted, Charles leaned close enough for only me to hear. "Don't make this difficult." It wasn't a warning, it was a preference. Difficulty complicates narratives. Narratives are how men like him survive. I smiled, because smiling keeps rooms comfortable, and discomfort is expensive. Inside, something hardened. This wasn't a termination, it was a rewrite. He intended to remove my name from the story, to replace outcomes with inheritance, to trade competence for youth and call it progress. I let him keep the moment. I was already counting the lines he'd crossed, and the ones he didn't know existed yet. That decision would cost them far more. "Hey, how are you holding up right now?" If this moment hit close to home, take a second to step near a window and let some daylight in. Even just by pulling the curtain back, it can change your mood more than you think. Tell me where you're listening from today. I read every comment, and it helps shape what comes next. If you want to stay with this story and others like it, subscribe and walk this path with me, because what she does next is where the silence finally starts to speak. They said it was about efficiency, about moving fast, about not carrying unnecessary weight. What they never said out loud was how much of that speed had been built on my back. As the room applauded Evan's promotion, my mind kept replaying moments they now pretended belonged to someone else. I remembered the compliance breach that should have shut us down for months. I was the one who rewrote the reporting framework overnight, coordinated with outside counsel, and kept regulators satisfied enough to walk away. I remembered the supplier collapse in Asia, the contracts rewritten clause by clause at 3 a.m, the deal saved before Charles even boarded his flight. Those weren't heroic stories. They were quiet fixes, the kind executives love until they're inconvenient. At the board meeting the following week, Charles presented a clean timeline. He spoke about strategic foresight and decisive leadership. Using my work like borrowed language, I sat 10 feet away, taking notes on a legal pad that suddenly felt like camouflage. When a director asked about risk mitigation, Charles smiled and said, "We anticipated that." He didn't look at me once. Evan, meanwhile, began dismantling what I'd built. He swapped vendors to impress a consultant friend, ignored warning memos, and pushed automation before testing the data integrity. Every objection I raised came back with the same answer. We're streamlining. Streamlining. Apparently, meant crossing out my recommendations with a red pen and calling it innovation. The unfairness wasn't loud. It was procedural. My approval stalled. My emails went unanswered. Decisions I'd made months earlier were quietly reversed, then failed on schedule. Each misstep tightened something in my chest. A pressure that grew sharper with every meeting where my name went unmentioned. I finally searched the internal archive late one night, not looking for proof, just clarity. Project summaries loaded slowly, one after another, until the pattern became impossible to miss. The work was still there. The outcomes were still praised. My name was gone, not missing, removed. That was the moment the anger stopped being abstract. Charles hadn't reacted to me recently. He'd planned this erasure long before the party. I closed the file and understood the truth they hoped I'd never see. I wasn't being sidelined. I'd already been written out. And with that realization, the injustice sharpened into resolve. Because systems remember everything, even when powerful people insist on forgetting consequences, the change didn't arrive with an announcement. It came quietly, disguised as a system update that logged me out and didn't let me back in. My credentials still existed, technically, but whole folders were suddenly restricted. Dashboards I had reviewed every morning now returned polite errors. Nothing dramatic, nothing accidental. By noon, 2 projects I'd led for over a year were reassigned. The notice came from operations, signed by Evan Whitmore, written in a tone that tried too hard to sound collaborative. To accelerate alignment, it said, "My name wasn't mentioned, I wasn't copied. I found out because a vendor called me, confused, asking why my approval no longer counted. I kept my posture neutral and my calendar intact. If this was a test, I wouldn't give them a reaction to measure. I forwarded questions to shared inboxes, documented every barrier, and waited. The silence that followed was instructive. Doors didn't slam. They simply stopped opening. Naomi Blake found me in the corridor that afternoon, her expression carefully blank. As chief financial officer, she understood patterns before they became headlines. "They're clearing the path," she said, quietly enough to pass as a greeting. "Budget authority, access layers, visibility. It's coordinated." I asked her how much time I had. She didn't answer directly. She never does when the truth is worse than the estimate. By the end of the week, Evan was presenting my work as his own roadmap. He spoke confidently about timelines he didn't understand and risks he hadn't read. When I corrected a figure, Charles cut me off with a smile and suggested we take it offline. Translation: not here, not now, not you. The betrayal wasn't personal. That's what made it colder. It was structural. Approved in meetings I wasn't invited to. Executed by people who smiled at me in the hallway. I stopped sleeping through the night. Not from panic, but from the sharp alertness that comes when you realize you're standing on ground that's already been sold. Late Friday, I opened my contract for the first time in months, not out of hope, but habit. I traced clauses the way surgeons read scans, looking for margins. That's when I saw it. The trigger condition for termination-based role transfer never activated. No notice, no formal reassignment, no execution date. They were acting as if the switch had been flipped. But legally, it hadn't. I closed the document and felt the chill settle into focus. This wasn't a purge completed. It was a purge in progress. And for the first time since the party, I wasn't behind the timeline anymore. I was watching them expose it. That difference would matter soon, in ways none of them had modeled. If you were me at this moment, what would you do? Leave a comment below. I stopped pushing back the moment I realized resistance was exactly what they expected. Silence unsettles people who rely on noise to assert control. I attended meetings, nodded at conclusions already decided, and asked questions that sounded harmless. On the surface, I complied. Underneath, I began preparing. The first step was disentanglement over the years. I had negotiated partner commitments under my own authority, a necessity when deals moved faster than board calendars. Those agreements didn't belong to Whitmore Solutions. They belonged to me, by design, a safeguard Charles once praised as efficient. I reviewed each one carefully, confirming terms, timelines, and contingencies, then activated the clauses that required periodic affirmation. No announcements, just confirmations sent, received, and logged. I stopped correcting Evan. Let him rush. Let him assume alignment meant agreement. His emails grew bolder, his decisions thinner. Vendors still called me first out of habit, and I redirected them politely, creating a trail of unanswered questions he didn't know how to close. Every interaction was documented, every response measured. Julian Cross reached out the following Monday, using a private channel we'd established years earlier when negotiations demanded discretion. He didn't ask how I was. He asked if I was still in control of certain instruments. I told him I was. He replied with a single line, "Then nothing has changed." The calm confidence of it steadied me. In the background, I verified the exclusivity language tied to our core supplier network. The clause had been controversial when I drafted it, criticized as too protective, too narrow. Charles had approved it anyway, distracted by quarterly numbers. That clause bound performance guarantees to my sign-off, not the company's title. Without it, service levels defaulted to baseline. With it, they accelerated. I didn't move quickly. I let the structure settle. Preparation isn't panic, it's patience applied with intent. I scheduled check-ins that looked routine and allowed assumptions to harden. People reveal everything once they believe the outcome is fixed. The realization arrived without drama. Whitmore Solutions wasn't just leaning on my work, it was leaning on a condition I controlled. Their timelines assumed continuity they hadn't secured. Their confidence was borrowed. I felt no rush of triumph, only a quiet clarity. They thought I only knew how to follow. What they never understood was that compliance had taught me the system better than defiance ever could. And systems, when left to their own logic, always favor the prepared. I adjusted my calendar to create space, not absence. Knowing visibility without influence breeds complacency. Each day, I refined contingencies, aligning dates and dependencies until the sequence felt inevitable. By choosing stillness, I gained leverage. By appearing finished, I invited mistakes. The groundwork was set, precise and quiet. Waiting for the moment pressure would expose what confidence had concealed from everyone watching closely. I learned about Evan's gamble the same way I learned about most things now indirectly. A junior analyst mentioned a bold pivot during a status call. Careful not to say my name. Evan had approved a vendor switch and accelerated deployment without audits. "We can't wait for perfect data," he'd said. Loud enough for the room. Speed is the strategy. The irony almost made me smile. I'd warned against that exact sequence months earlier. In writing, those memos were gone. But memory isn't so easily deleted. Partners noticed immediately. Questions arrived wrapped in politeness, then sharpened into concern. One by one, they asked for reassurances Evan couldn't provide. I stayed quiet. Silence. At this stage, was not consent, it was observation. I watched meetings shorten and tempers thin. I watched timelines compress until risk hid behind optimism. When a supplier paused shipments pending clarification, Evan brushed it off. "They'll come around," he told Charles. "They always do." They didn't. Calls that once returned within minutes drifted into voicemail. A regional partner froze expansion plans, citing uncertainty. Another invoked a review clause and stepped back entirely. Each withdrawal tightened the air. Evan filled it with bravado. "This is just noise," he said. "We're modernizing." I tracked the exits on a private ledger. Dates aligned with decisions. Patterns form when you stop interrupting them. The company's confidence was evaporating. molecule by molecule, and no one in the room wanted to name it. I kept my face neutral and my notes precise. Then Julian called. He didn't ask permission to speak. He announced a fact. We crossed the threshold today. He said, 17%. I asked him how quietly. He laughed once, quiet enough to be legal. The number landed heavier than applause ever had. 17% wasn't control, but it was leverage with teeth. On the open market, it looked like interest. Inside the building, it would read as pressure. Evan didn't know yet. Charles would soon. I returned to my calendar and marked nothing. The suspense wasn't theatrical, it was procedural. Every reckless choice had shortened the fuse, and every retreating partner had trimmed the margin. I didn't need to intervene. I only needed to keep watching while the successor proved. Step by step. That replacing experience with confidence is the fastest way to dismantle what you never built. Meanwhile, emails from legal grew longer, not clearer, and risk dashboards flickered yellow. I felt the tension coil, a live wire under carpet. No one asked my opinion anymore. That omission said everything. Anticipation sharpened into patience. The board would learn soon that momentum without anchors drifts, and markets punish drift without mercy. Timing would be the difference between panic and collapse. Before I go on, how do you think this will end? The emergency meeting happened without me, which was how I knew it mattered. Calendars filled. Assistants whispered, and the executive floor tightened like a clenched jaw. By the time I heard the phrase extraordinary session, the air had already shifted. Panic doesn't announce itself, it leaks. Later, I learned the room had turned hostile fast. Directors spoke over one another, numbers flashed red, and projections contradicted last week's confidence. Someone asked why partners were freezing commitments. Someone else demanded explanations for shipment delays. Charles tried to steady it. "This is temporary," he said, louder than necessary. "We're still in control." The word control landed poorly. Pressure has a sound when it builds. Chairs scraped, papers shuffled. A director finally said what everyone was thinking. "Who signed off on this?" Evan answered too quickly. "I did," he said. "We needed momentum." Charles snapped for the first time. "Momentum isn't governance." The room went quiet. Then, restless again. That's when my name surfaced. Tentative at first. "Bella handled this before." Someone offered. Another added. "She knew the dependencies." Charles resisted. Pacing. "She's not part of this track." A beat passed. Then, sharper. "Get her back in the room." It wasn't an invitation. It was an admission. The message reached me as a forwarded note marked urgent. "Please join immediately." It read, no context, no apology. I imagined the scene, Charles gripping the table, Evan shrinking into charts, the board realizing confidence doesn't substitute for process. I didn't rush. I reread the agenda, then the minutes I wasn't copied on, and felt the pressure crest without touching me. I replied in writing, "Clear, measured, final. I won't attend." I said, "Any questions should be submitted formally." I attached references, clauses, and a timeline. The refusal wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. That made it worse for them. Phones rang, my inbox filled. Charles called twice. I didn't answer. When he finally left a message, his voice was tight. "We need you," he said. Need replaces authority when leverage shifts. I sat still, documenting the moment. Panic had done what silence couldn't. It exposed the fracture. By declining the room, I forced the record. Pressure rose, then stalled, searching for an outlet I wouldn't provide. The board would adjourn eventually, carrying unanswered questions and a paper trail that pointed nowhere but forward. And in that space, created by refusal, the balance finally tipped. The system didn't collapse all at once. It responded, step by step, the way it was designed to when inputs stopped matching reality. Clauses triggered. Timers expired. Notices went out automatically. unemotional and precise. Watching it unfold felt less like revenge and more like physics. The first agreement fell apart on a Tuesday morning. A partner exercised determination right after a missed performance checkpoint. Legal called it routine. Evan called it unexpected. In the follow-up call, he promised remedies he couldn't authorize and timelines he didn't control. "We'll fix it," he said, too quickly. Silence followed. Then a formal withdrawal. Next came the dominoes. A distribution contract reverted to baseline terms, cutting margins overnight. A service-level guarantee downgraded after sign-off failed to arrive. None of it required intervention. The language was clear, the deadlines documented, the sequence inevitable. I received copies because my name still sat on the original frameworks. A ghost in the workflow. Meetings grew tense. Evan presented slides that didn't reconcile, answers that shifted mid-sentence. When pressed, he deflected. "The data's noisy," he said. "We need time. Time." However, was the one variable the system doesn't negotiate. Numbers told their own story. And it wasn't generous. Charles tried to reassert command, calling vendors personally, leaning on relationships he assumed were permanent. "We've worked together for years," he said on one call I was copied on. The reply was polite and devastating. "We're honoring the agreement as written. No anger, no drama, just adherence." By Thursday, the board demanded clarity. Evan faltered under direct questioning. Confusing process with outcome, authority with approval. Someone asked who had validated the risk model. He hesitated. Another director asked who owned the escalation path. He guessed. The room cooled. I remained silent, documenting responses and timestamps. The peak arrived quietly, with an email stamped external. The audit committee had initiated a review, citing discrepancies between approvals and execution. Effective immediately. It read, "We will assess governance controls." That line changed everything. Audits don't accuse, they examine, they don't shout, they preserve. Once invoked, they pull threads until patterns emerge. Evan's shortcuts were suddenly visible, not as mistakes, but as deviations. Charles's interventions appeared as overrides. The record spoke without my voice. I felt no satisfaction, only distance. Systems don't hate anyone. They respond to inputs. They reward alignment and punish improvisation, masquerading as leadership, as files populated and calendars cleared. The pressure shifted from chaos to containment. When the day ended, I closed my laptop and noted the date. The sequence had completed. The reaction was underway. From here on, outcomes would be attributed, not argued. The system had done its part, exactly as designed, and in doing so, revealed what confidence alone had hidden. The meeting was scheduled without theatrics, yet the air carried weight the moment Charles Whitmore entered my office. He closed the door himself and stood there, hands clasped, searching my face for an emotion I refused to give. "This didn't have to go this far," he said, already framing the past as my failure. I invited him to sit. He declined, choosing accusation over conversation. He blamed market volatility, reckless partners, even Evan's inexperience, listing excuses as if speed could turn them into truth. "You stopped cooperating," he said. "You left us exposed." I listened, steady, because interruption would have softened the edges. When he finished, I asked one question. Which approval failed first? He hesitated, then guessed. That pause was everything. I turned my screen so he could see the sequence. Emails, signatures, timestamps, each aligned to decisions he authorized and overrides he demanded. I didn't editorialize. I didn't raise my voice. I scrolled. He watched his own directives appear. Forwarded, acknowledged, executed. "That's out of context," he said. I zoomed out. Context expanded and trapped him. He tried again. "Louder now. You could have warned us." I nodded and opened a folder labeled Escalations. The messages were polite, precise, and unanswered. His name appeared in the headers like a refrain. I read one line aloud. Pending your sign-off. The room compressed. He sat. The pressure showed in his jaw when he realized what the audit committee would see. Not malice, not sabotage, but a pattern of shortcuts wearing authority as camouflage. You wanted this, he said. I shook my head. I wanted governance. Silence stretched, heavy and narrow. He asked what I wanted now. I answered with procedure. The committee had met. Council had reviewed. The board required a change. He understood the language immediately, because he'd used it on others. Resignation preserved the company. Resistance would expose more. He stared at the window, calculating losses that could no longer be moved. When he stood, the fight drained from him. You're forcing me out, he said. I corrected him gently. The record is, he signed the letter the same way he'd signed the overrides. Quickly, assuming momentum could outrun consequence. This time, it couldn't, after he left. I saved the file and closed my calendar. The confrontation ended without shouting, without applause. Power didn't change hands. Accountability returned to its place. The words he'd never finished echoed briefly, then disappeared, replaced by a quieter truth that required no completion. I felt the restraint settle deeper. Not relief, but compression. The kind that steadies a structure before load. Outside my office, assistants moved carefully, voices lowered, as if the building understood what had shifted. I didn't celebrate. I archived. I prepared for questions that would come, for narratives that would be rewritten, for a board that would need clarity, not drama. Pressure remained. But it was directional now, aimed forward, unavoidable, and finally honest. It closed the chapter, without mercy, without noise, and left consequences standing, waiting, counted, exact. The announcement came quietly, which felt appropriate. No banners, no speeches, no victory laps, just a filing released before markets opened, confirming that Whitmore Solutions would sell a significant portion of its assets to a consortium led by Julian Cross. The company would survive. Control would not. Evan left the industry 2 weeks later. There was no scandal attached to his exit, only a polite press line about pursuing other opportunities. Recruiters stopped calling him. Boards stopped returning messages. In this business, disappearance is rarely dramatic. It's administrative. I felt no pleasure watching it happen, only a settled sense that outcomes had finally aligned with capability. The restructuring stabilized operations quickly. Contracts were renegotiated. Service levels normalized. Employees kept their jobs, which mattered more to me than headlines. I was offered my old position back through an intermediary, framed as reconciliation. I declined without countering. Returning would have implied nostalgia. Nostalgia clouds judgment. Instead, I watched from the perimeter as Julian's team integrated systems and installed oversight. The tone changed immediately. Fewer slogans, more checklists. Governance returned to the center. Where it belonged, Charles's name faded from communications, replaced by committees and frameworks that didn't rely on a single personality to function. I stayed deliberately absent, consulting only when asked, documenting only what was necessary. Distance preserves clarity. When the final agreements were circulated, my role appeared in one line that mattered more than titles ever had: strategic veto authority over material changes affecting partner commitments. It wasn't ceremonial. It was structural. That clause ensured the company could not repeat the shortcuts that nearly broke it. Any attempt to rush, override, or rebrand risk as innovation would stop cold, not by argument, but by process. Power didn't sit in a corner office anymore. It lived in alignment. People asked why I didn't step back in. I told them the truth. Influence without dependency is the cleanest form of leverage. I didn't need to be visible to be effective. I needed the system to behave. When the dust settled, Whitmore Solutions remained operational, smaller and steadier. Careers had ended, Jobs had been saved. No one celebrated publicly. That felt right. Justice. When it works, doesn't demand applause. I closed the file and moved on, satisfied not because I'd won, but because the company could no longer confuse confidence with competence. The balance had shifted. It would hold. I did not announce my role, and that omission was intentional. Quiet authority lasts longer than declared power. Every major decision now paused, checked dependencies, and surfaced consequences before execution. The process slowed just enough to prevent ego from masquerading as leadership. I monitored outcomes, not people, trusting structure over charisma. In time, even skeptics adapted. The system learned, and because it learned, it endured. That was the difference this time, and it made all future shortcuts impossible to hide for everyone involved internally. I left the building on a morning that felt deliberately ordinary. No escorts, no announcements, no one watching to see if I would hesitate. I handed over access cards, signed a receipt, and stepped into a future that no longer required explanations. For years, my value had been measured by how much chaos I could absorb without letting it show. Walking away felt lighter than any promotion. I didn't need to reclaim titles or correct narratives. The system I helped rebuild no longer depended on me. And that was the point. People asked if I felt victorious. I didn't. Victory implies a battle still echoing. What I felt was release. The tension that once kept me alert finally loosened, replaced by something quieter and more durable. Clarity. I watched Whitmore Solutions continue without drama. Processes held. Oversight worked. The work remained. The theatrics were gone. Leaving wasn't a punishment for them. It was permission for me. Permission to choose environments where governance mattered more than ego, where experience wasn't treated as an inconvenience, and where silence wasn't mistaken for weakness. I closed the last file, archived the correspondence, and turned my attention elsewhere, not backward, never backward. Justice doesn't announce itself when it's complete. It simply stops asking for attention. I didn't ruin them. I didn't expose secrets or burn bridges. I let consequences follow decisions without interference. That restraint was the final act. I don't call it revenge. Revenge is loud and temporary. This was quieter. And it will last. The chapter closed cleanly, leaving no debris behind. Only a steady path forward that finally belonged to me alone at last. I didn't make them collapse. I simply stopped holding them upright. What this experience taught me is simple, but not easy. Your worth is not proven by how long you endure being underestimated, but by how clearly you choose yourself when the truth is undeniable. I didn't win by shouting louder or striking back. I won by stepping aside and letting systems, records, and consequences speak in my place. Sometimes dignity is not about standing your ground. It's about knowing when to let go and trust that integrity compounds over time. If this story resonated with you, tell me where you're listening from right now. I read every comment, and your perspective matters more than you think. If you've ever faced a moment where silence felt like the hardest choice, share your thoughts below. And if stories like this help you see your own struggles more clearly, please like, share, and subscribe. Quiet strength deserves to be heard, and this channel is where those stories continue.